The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Members of the full committee who are not members of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance may participate in today's hearing, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is entitled Countering the Financial Weapons or Networks of Weapons of Proliferation. I now recognize myself for 2 minutes to give an opening statement. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today's hearing will examine the financial networks that support nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons productions, the role of the U.S. in counter-proliferation finance efforts, and the scope and effectiveness of the relevant enforcement actions by the U.S. to counter-proliferation financing. Hostile nations often use established financial mechanisms such as wire transfer, trade finance products, cash, checks, and credit cards to finance their weapons programs. This is accomplished through elaborate ownership structures consisting of various businesses, shell corporations, and middlemen that are often used to obscure any connection to the country proliferating weapons. As these bad actors continue to evolve in the ways that they access the traditional financial marketplace, we must ensure that our government agencies and financial institutions have the tools necessary to detect illicit procurement efforts. Evidence has shown that hostile actors around the world have pursued the proliferation of various weapons for years. As country sanctions and even secondary sanctions are implemented, removed, or modified, a balance must be struck. Financial institutions should work together to prevent illicit financing while providing agreed-upon market access. In today's hearing, I hope to discuss what methods are being used to circumvent sanctions to finance weapons proliferation, what tools and partnerships are working well to detect and disrupt procurement networks, and what challenges remain for government authorities and financial institutions to identify proliferation activities. But also appreciate any comments about deficiencies and weaknesses in the international system and how the United States can best assist to ensure that the funding of proliferation can effectively be stopped in this dynamic environment. I'm especially interested in hearing about this in light of that the United States is assuming the presidency of the Financial Action Task Force this month. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their expert testimony on these very important issues. The chair now recognizes Mr. Foster for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for testifying this afternoon. Today, the subcommittee is going to examine strategies to disrupt the financing and procurement of weapons of mass destruction. We are at an interesting time in our history, to say the least. We have a number of potential threats. These include not very well organized groups trying to get the parts together for a dirty bomb. We have states, for example, Iran, who are looking to assemble a bomb factory. And we're talking also about stolen nuclear weapons from states where the security is not so great. And finally, the big issue of making sure that we have complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea, a much more difficult problem where we're looking not for a bomb factory, but for a single completed bomb secreted away anywhere in that country. And so in all but the last case, there are significant signatures to go after, and some of the most significant ones are the financial footprints that lead to that, and that's why this hearing is important. For nearly a generation, nuclear weapons have threatened our national security and global safety because of their capability to threaten the existence of mankind. And unfortunately, this ability is no longer unique to just nuclear weapons. The proliferation of emerging technologies, chemical, biological, and radiological weapons, and their related delivery system pose a real risk to our international security. Even today, rogue regimes and clandestine organizations continue to exhibit the ambition to acquire materials and technologies that can be used to build weapons of mass destruction, which is why, despite many challenges, prevention of the distribution and financing of these weapons remains a major U.S. policy objective. To date, the international community has utilized a variety of tools to accomplish this, including export controls, sanctions, anti-money laundering laws, and international treaties. But despite these measures, proliferators have continued to use the financial system with relative ease to facilitate their illicit procurement of materials. Alternative and creative sources of funding have allowed them the ability to circumvent the global counterproliferation financing rules and many of the standard detection methods, posing a major obstacle for law enforcement and the intelligence community. On July 1st, 2018, the United States assumed the position of the President of the Financial Action Task Force, an intergovernmental body tasked with developing and promoting policies to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. This presents an invaluable opportunity for us to highlight the criticality of this issue within the organization's already established framework and to show leadership in important multilateral collaborations. Going forward, we must encourage the use of technological innovations and policies that improve our counterproliferation efforts. I look forward to hearing your testimony and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Congressman Foster for holding this hearing today. Additionally, I would like to thank all of our witnesses for coming in today to provide us with their expertise in our efforts to counter the financing of weapons proliferation. As technology progresses, terrorist networks acquire new means for acquiring the illicit financing needed to procure weapons of mass destruction. The most important step in protecting our national security and that of our allies is to prevent these organizations from acquiring these weapons. Traditional financial mechanisms such as cash, credit cards, and wire transfers are often used by proliferation networks to facilitate their funding activities. We already know of these mechanisms and must continue to ensure we are capable of identifying their use for malicious purposes and preventing them. However, we must focus our efforts on ensuring we're able to combat the use of new mechanisms that have developed with today's technology for the purposes of financing weapons proliferation. Such mechanisms include the use of blockchain technology, which serves as the public transaction ledger for Bitcoin, other forms of cryptocurrency, or online crowdfunding websites. While these financial mechanisms provide various positive and valuable opportunities, they're also very popular with terrorist networks due to the anonymity that is associated with their utilization. There is a global black market for nuclear technology and material that we must work to detect and eradicate. Hostile state actors which have been involved with this market pose a serious threat to our national security. States such as Iran can also use front companies to acquire critical nuclear technologies with the use of intermediate jurisdictions in order to obfuscate our efforts in tracing their transactions. Learning how to better combat such practices in order to ensure sanctions are not evaded must be a priority. Additionally, we must strategize how to assist other nations with their capabilities to prevent proliferation financing. There are numerous countries which are currently not able to successfully prevent proliferation financing, and this poses an obstacle to global counterproliferation efforts. We look forward to learning how we can expand our efforts in combating illicit finance for weapons proliferation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of our witnesses. Mr. David Albright is a physicist, is founder and president of the nonprofit Institute for Science and International Security in Washington, D.C. Notably, the Institute publishes the Peddling Peril Index that ranks countries according to their capabilities and demonstrated success in implementing strategic export controls to prevent nuclear trafficking. Mr. Albright has been called the go-to guy for media seeking independent analysis of Iraq's weapons program. In June of 1996, he was the first non-governmental inspector of the Iraqi nuclear program. Prior to founding the Institute for Science and International Security in 1993, Mr. Albright was a senior staff scientist at the Federation of American Scientists and a member of the research staff of Princeton University's Center for Energy and Environmental Studies. Mr. Albright received a Master's of Science in Physics from Indiana University in 1980, a Master's of Science in Mathematics from Wright State University in 1977, and a Bachelor of Science from Wright State University in 1975. Mr. Tom Keating is Director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies, better known as RUSI. RUSI is headquartered in London and is the oldest defense and security think tank in the world. Mr. Keating primarily researches areas including terror finance, counter-proliferation finance, new approaches to tackling financial crimes and human trafficking, as well as corruption and the implementation of financial sanctions. Prior to joining RUSI in 2014, he was an investment banker at Jpmoorgan for 20 years. Mr. Keating has a master's in intelligence and international security from King's College London. This is Mr. Keating's first congressional testimony in the United States. Thank you for traveling all this way to speak to us. And stop by New Mexico and spend money out there, too, on the way home. Mr. Ottolenghi is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, an expert at its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. At FDD, he focuses on Iran's history of sanctions evasion. His research has examined Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including its links to the country's energy sector and procurement networks. Prior to joining FDD, Dr. Ottolenghi headed the Transatlantic Institute in Brussels and taught Israel studies at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. He obtained his PhD in political theory at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, preceded by undergraduate studies in political science at the University of Bologna. Ms. Elizabeth Rosenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Energy and Economics and Security Program at the Center for New American Security, CNAS. In this capacity, she publishes and speaks on the national security and foreign policy implications of energy market shifts and the use of sanctions and economic statecraft. She has testified before Congress on energy and financial issues, and we welcome her back. From May 2009 through 2013, Ms. Rosenberg served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at Treasury. She received an MA in Near Eastern Studies from New York University and a BA in Politics and Religion from Oberlin College. Each of you are going to be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Albright, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce and Ranking Member Foster, for the opportunity to testify today. As the Chairman mentioned, my institute recently published a report ranking the export control systems of 200 countries.
If you could turn your mic on and the red button and then pull it up nice and close.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, scoot it over toward you. Pull it right on up. Pull the base of the mic to you.
Okay. In the index that we recently released, we ranked 200 countries and territories based on their capabilities and performance in 5 areas addressing export control legislation: international commitments, illicit procurement detection, enforcement and financing of proliferation. Preventing proliferation financing, albeit not a traditional component of a review of national export control systems, is one of the most important aspects for detecting and stopping exports of sensitive goods. To measure a country's ability to prevent proliferation financing, we used a set of criteria that indicate a country's susceptibility to being exploited or involved in proliferation financing, including violations of international sanctions. These criteria are based on countries' financial regulatory systems and counter-illicit financing programs, for which the main source of data for the index is the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. Our research for the 2017 ranking revealed that preventing proliferation financing is one of the counter-proliferation areas most in need of improvement. This effort would benefit significantly from a closer integration with export controls. In the ranking of a country's ability to prevent proliferation financing, no country achieved 2/3 of the available points, and only 2 received more than half the available points. About 1/3 of all countries achieved negative scores. Among others, significant illicit financial flows, big black markets, and high levels of corruption indicate that those countries are likely places where front companies find it relatively easy to finance nefarious activities. Other countries perform poorly due to having excessive bank secrecy, providing tax havens, or simply lacking regulations and effective institutions. A preliminary update for 2018 on preventing proliferation financing shows similar results. Countries still perform poorly, and only 3 countries receive 50% or more of the possible points. Iran performs particularly poorly in the index, including on proliferation financing where it ranked on the bottom. Iran has been given extended time to fulfill its action plan requirements set out by the FATF and to comply with FATF standards. Recent actions have confirmed the deep involvement of Iran's financial system in illicit activities. As a result, we recommend the reimposition of FATF counterproliferation measures against Iran. The Institute has developed a range of other recommendations while producing the Peddling Peril Index and working with proliferation financing experts to develop the index's methodology. One of the most critical recommendations is that countering proliferation financing needs to be integrated into other aspects of counterproliferation, including export controls. And I would like to highlight 5 other recommendations. All countries should work closely with FATF and its regional bodies to improve their efforts to prevent proliferation financing. Each country should conduct a risk assessment of proliferation financing, and its agencies should address any gaps identified. Each government should have adequate legislation in place that includes an effective system of coordination among departments working on proliferation financing, such as well-resourced investigative financial intelligence units and effective outreach to financial institutions. Countries' financial institutions need to be able to monitor, detect, report, and act upon suspicious financial transactions. Countries should help financial institutions identify and freeze suspicious transactions. Because of the difficulty of accomplishing this goal, the U.S. government should launch an interagency study to improve communication and information sharing with financial institutions, including insurance companies, and to develop better solutions for automated counterproliferation financing screening tools. FATF is in a unique position to drive many of the above-mentioned recommended actions and changes, and should do so. Financing of proliferation should be treated broadly and as a separate subject to money laundering and terrorist financing. At the plenary meetings, the FATF working group should discuss adjusting the language in several of the existing 40 FATF recommendations to extend them beyond terrorist financing and money laundering to include proliferation financing. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes now.
Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Foster, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today, my first opportunity to do so. Given my home base in London and the focus of RUSI's counter-proliferation finance research is on Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, my testimony and contribution will necessarily address to a greater extent the international CPF architecture as promoted by bodies such as the UN and the Financial Action Task Force, rather than the policies laid out by US domestic agencies. However, as has been mentioned, with the US taking over presidency of the Financial Action Task Force for the next 12 months, the US has a key role to play in strengthening this weak architecture. You'll be familiar with the CPF requirements set forth by the FATF standards and the evaluations undertaken by the FATF. The US evaluation was published in December 2016. As indicated by the table provided in my written submission, the international CPF effort is disappointing. 2/3 of assessed countries are non or only partially compliant with the requirement to be able to impose targeted financial sanctions without delay. And 70% of assessed countries have a low or moderate level of effectiveness, meaning they suffer from major shortcomings. It is clear that notwithstanding the prioritization of CPF in 2012 by the FATF, the global community still has considerable work to do to harden the financial system against abuse by proliferators. And it's important to note that compliance with FATF standards alone does not result in effective CPF controls. In fact, FATF's recommendations are now increasingly out of touch with other international obligations on CPF. UN sanctions against North Korea incorporate measures that go beyond list-based sanctions implementation and focus to a greater extent on activity-based obligations to counter proliferation finance. So how do we secure the financial system against abuse by proliferators? Proliferation activities are made possible by the international financial system. Reports from the UN panel of experts highlight that Pyongyang is using greater ingenuity in accessing formal banking channels to support illicit activities and WMD proliferation, and continues to access the international financial system because of critical sanctions implementation deficiencies. The role played by the financial sector in disrupting proliferation finance has received greater attention in recent years. Some governments maintain that financial institutions have both the capability to detect and an obligation to disrupt financial transactions in support of illicit WMD proliferation. However, government initiatives on counter-proliferation finance vary widely between jurisdictions and are often, in our experience, non-existent. Our research reveals extensive gaps in knowledge, awareness, and capabilities at banks, and perhaps more worryingly, highlights considerable misunderstanding with regards to the risks posed by proliferators, often conflating CPF activity with sanctions compliance. It's therefore important that financial institutions take time to better understand and mitigate proliferation financing risk. But it's not just in banking where vulnerability exists. As sectoral sanctions have been increasingly applied to North Korea, it has undertaken creative, deceptive activity to secure funding from the sale of coal, and it has also undertaken at-sea ship-to-ship transfers to secure the energy products it needs. These activities bring into scope other industries needed to secure the integrity of the international supply chain that would benefit from engagement with national governments, such as shipping companies, commodity brokers, and insurance companies, all of which lag the banking sector in terms of awareness of and capability and commitment to the global CPF agenda. Whilst the banking sector must continually strive to improve its standards, a whole-of-system approach is needed in order to maximize disruption opportunities. So to conclude, as evidenced by the FATF's evaluation data and the detailed reports of the UN panel of experts on North Korea, 6 years since the FATF introduced CPF as a third leg of focus alongside money laundering and terrorist financing, global CPF efforts are fragmented at best and ineffective and non-existent at worst. Furthermore, the current FATF standards related to CPF are weak and simplistic. They do not require countries to assess their proliferation financing risks. They focus merely on the implementation of targeted financial sanctions, and they are not risk-based in their application. In sum, the global architecture for disrupting proliferation finance requires improved design and implementation. In my submission, I have set forth recommendations for the private sector, international organizations such as the FATF, the US government, and international governments that I hope we can discuss further during this session. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Adelange, 5 minutes.
Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Foster, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I want to
Go ahead and pull that mic right on up. Just pull the entire base to
Yes.
make sure the red light's on.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to have me here to testify. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been under U.S. sanctions since late 1979. From 2006 to 2016, Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs were the target of a United Nations sanction regime, which the United States, the European Union, and their Western allies subsequently expanded with their own set of far-reaching measures. Initially designed to punish and prevent proliferation attempts, sanctions eventually became wider in scope, targeting Iran's energy industry, financial sector, including its central bank, shipping, aviation, insurance, and oil exports. Beginning in January 2016, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Jcpoa, granted Iran sanctions relief, though not to non-nuclear sanctions. Due to the President's May 2018 decision to withdraw from the Jcpoa, Iran again faces U.S. sanctions, including secondary sanctions, which are already causing numerous international companies to withdraw from the Iranian market. Iran is therefore likely to ramp up its sanction evasion efforts. Sanctions significantly inhibit Tehran's ability to trade with the world. Still, Iran has adapted, engaging sanctions enforcers in a complex and evolving cat-and-mouse game. To put it bluntly, for Iran, sanctions are temporary roadblocks, not insurmountable obstacles. By building bypass roads, Iran turns crises into opportunities. As a result, Iran has been able to mitigate sanctions' impact on its efforts to advance its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. My written testimony illustrates how Iran evaded sanctions in the past, offering typologies as well as case studies. Let me briefly outline some of these practices. Procurement usually relies on a triangular structure of front companies operating overseas. Iranian proxies establish fronts in a foreign country to procure dual-use technologies. Once incorporated, companies buy locally or from a third country. The buyer then ships the procured goods to a final destination in Iran or fictitiously sells them to another foreign company in another country before final delivery. These cases typically involve small companies which will shut down once they have accomplished their mission. For longer-term procurement and finance operations, Iran relies more on permanent and more complex corporate structures across different jurisdictions. Their link with an Iranian parent entity is purposely made less obvious. Iranian senior corporate managers often fictitiously resign their government jobs to seek business ventures overseas on behalf of the regime, quickly emerging as proprietors of business empires with no formal ties with Iran. A regime proxy with no formal connection to past employers provides plausible deniability. Former regime procurement agents interviewed by FTD confirmed that Iranian state companies have increasingly entrusted their most capable senior management with significant sums to invest in industrial assets abroad. This includes ownership of Western factories, which gives Iran access to knowledge and technology. This was the case in 2013 of MCS International in Germany. Regime agents bought the factory to lay their hands on a dual-use flow-forming machine that MCS production line used to shape gas cylinders. Such machines are also critical in the production of uranium enrichment centrifuges. Iran's evasion of financial sanctions follows the same playbook. The regime first established and then sought to purchase banks outside Iran to facilitate prohibited banking transactions, adding successive layers of obfuscation to cover its tracks. This was the case, for example, with Investbank in the Republic of Georgia. The network associated with the bank used shell companies in Canada, the US, Georgia, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Turkey, New Zealand, and the UAE to launder billions of dollars according to US court documents, while also procuring and shipping technology to Tehran, likely on an airline owned by the network. The regime has also been very capable at exploiting loopholes in sanctions legislation. One such case was the Gas for Gold scheme its proxies ran through Turkey, and which I describe at length in my written statement. The regime will not hesitate to invest significant resources to facilitate these activities and empower its agents. A typical ancillary service its agents rely upon is the acquisition of passports of convenience, usually through costly citizenship by investment schemes, to be able to travel, incorporate companies, and open bank accounts hassle-free. Iranian sanction evasion activity follows established patterns. Financial institutions and intelligence practitioners can study these typologies to identify actors and transactions that are potentially harmful to the integrity of the financial system or pose challenges to international security. Treasury plays a key role in this regard. Its designations have helped expose Iranian efforts to circumvent sanctions. But as indicated before, this is a cat-and-mouse game where one can never assume that countermeasures are the final word, as Iran will seek a way around them. This is just one of the topics in my recommendations, which I offered in my written statement. I do thank you for your time and the invitation once again, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rosenberg, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pierce, Ranking Member Foster, and distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to speak today on countering the financial networks of weapons proliferation. The financing of weapons of mass destruction proliferation is a grave threat facing the United States and the global financial system. The ability of rogue states or non-state actors to obtain weapons of mass destruction by using illicit financial activity and procurement networks is a major challenge to the U.S. foreign policy goals, to the security of our homeland and that of our partners, and to the integrity of the global financial system and the global non-proliferation regime. Countering proliferation finance must be a core part of the policy approach to the United States' most pressing national security concerns, specifically North Korea, Iran, and Syria. Furthermore, the United States must lead on this issue in international forums, doing much more than at the present nascent measures. This essential work is undeniably challenging. Proliferation finance is difficult to detect. It is hidden within shell companies and among legitimate financial transactions. Looking for it is a technically challenging exercise at the intersection of sanctions enforcement, export controls, financial crimes compliance, and the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. As counter-proliferation finance work must operate across multiple jurisdictions, involve an array of different constituencies with different legal and regulatory authorities, and which have various privacy and data sharing obligations, and with major differentiation in political will and technical capacity, coordinating a truly effective international response is not easy. But the difficulties associated with countering the financing of proliferation should not give the false impression that creating a more effective policy framework is beyond the capacity of the international community. We know the deficiencies in the system. We certainly care about nuclear security, and we can do better. Let's start with the regulatory regime. Compliance and oversight programs for financial institutions have historically focused on financial integrity threats other than proliferation finance, like anti-money laundering and anti-corruption and countering terrorist financing efforts. Proliferation, including by North Korea and Iran, is no less significant as a security threat and must be treated as such. If policy leaders clarify that proliferation finance is on par with the obligation to counter terrorism, for example, it will go a long way to raise the profile of this issue and improve controls around it. This can have a direct benefit in improving the ability of vulnerable jurisdictions, such as Hong Kong or Malaysia, for example, to deny proliferators safe haven and a safe passage for their money. The United States should be the gold standard for information sharing relevant to proliferation finance between institutions, with governments, and across jurisdictions. Sections 314A and B of the USA Patriot Act are good models for creating the operational ability to facilitate information sharing, but policymakers must focus on expanding and incentivizing the use of these measures and in urging adoption of parallel measures in other jurisdictions. U.S. policy leaders must also work with international counterparts to harmonize such data sharing measures with privacy regulations so that justifiable concerns about misuse of personal data do not prevent cooperation and disrupting and preventing proliferation, an important law enforcement and international security priority. Congress has a direct role to play in encouraging more information collection, analysis, and public disclosure around proliferation finance. This includes supporting rigorous customer due diligence practices by banks, by not allowing anonymous companies to abuse our financial system, and by supporting a regulatory sandbox and safe harbor provisions to incentivize creative strategies to counter proliferation finance. And Congress must aggressively encourage the administration to publicly and privately disclose proliferation finance data and typologies, including via FinCEN advisories. Moreover, Congress should strongly support the administration in its new role as the Financial Action Task Force president, as has been discussed by several of my co-panelists here, to set tough new international guidelines for tracking and sharing information on proliferation finance, and for taking that action at the national level. I want to close by stating how grave the consequences are for failing to appreciate the seriousness of the proliferation finance threat. Complacency and policy inaction are weak links that help U.S. adversaries to actively and alarmingly develop nuclear weapons capabilities. The stakes could not be higher. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering questions you may have.
Thanks to each one of you for your presentations. I yield myself now 5 minutes for questions. First, so just looking at the complexity of tracking the financial aspects and the shell corporations, just everything is very complex. The sanctions have, it sounds like, according to your testimony, an effect, but also it's very difficult to assess for financial institutions to assess who the players are that are legitimate, who are not, legitimate transactions versus those that are gearing towards proliferation. So I guess my question is, how do we get around this obscurity? Let's back that up one section and say, is when the major, can we assess that most of the compromises of our sanctions are purposeful or just plain inability to see? You want to, Mr. Keating, you want to take a shot at that? I know it's just going to be kind of a guess, but.
So we're sitting here in the United States, surrounded by a sophisticated financial system. And yes, we're right that front companies and all of this are used to try and obfuscate the movement of funds. But let's not forget, look in a UN panel report, and it's a litany of failures in countries where it's just that they don't understand the risk that they're faced with.
And what would we do to drive the understanding?
So your government spends a lot of money providing technical assistance and awareness raising to countries like Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique, these kinds of countries where North Korea are earning money, raising money through providing services that they can then spend on their proliferation ambition. So I think there's a polarized position here. There is raising very basic standards, implementing basic understanding, which is what we would expect the FATF to be doing. And then there is dealing with the more complex structures and obfuscation that the other panelists have spoken about. And yes, there are financial institutions that will no doubt facilitate the illicit movement of finance knowingly. Equally, there are many financial institutions that do that without realizing they're doing it because of the complexity of the structures
Okay,
that are used.
Mr. Ottolenghi, on page 2, you talk about the adapting of the purchasing system. I assume that means that we start with a legitimate purchasing system, and then we begin to adapt, and we get people who are selling to the companies familiar, and then they adapt it closer and closer to proliferation. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay, so is it possible, so then is it a profit motive? Is it just sheer complacency? Is it a kind of a combination of corruption and profit motive and complacency that would drive the companies to continue selling? They just don't watch that close? Tell me a little bit about that.
It's a combination. I mean, on the part of those involved in helping, assisting Iran to procure, there is the profit. Sometimes there is also the ideology, and more often than not, the two things converge.
So it gets pretty difficult to assess precisely. And so, Ms. Rosenberg, then, so listening to that particular thing, do you think there would be advantage into having some piece of the sanctions push downstream to people who either through carelessness or whatever, they begin to feel not the full sanctions, but sanctions of some sort against them? If they just didn't pay attention, they're corrupt. I mean, we can't assess their mindset. Is it possible to have sanctions move downstream to the places where the financing is coming from? Is that too difficult?
There are many opportunities to use sanctions to advance our counterproliferation objectives. The two primary focus areas that we should attend to now are the lack of political will to enforce. Just because the UN has sanctions, just because the United States has sanctions, does not mean that people are following.
Okay, let me catch it right here, though. But the U.S. has invoked sanctions on countries where we're trying to stop the proliferation, and the countries where the will is lacked, our sanctions to North Korea or Iran or whoever would begin to percolate downstream to those that don't have as strong a motive for interrupting. Is that too egregious?
There are opportunities.
Take a quick shot, and I want Mr. Ottolenghi to address it too.
I just want to give an example.
Yeah, let her finish, and then I'll come to you. Just 19 seconds, so.
I just want to give an example which I think illustrates the point you're making very well. Monday, Treasury targeted a service provider for Mahan Air, the IRGC airline, the airline that carries weapons and personnel to Syria. The service provider is in Malaysia. It transacts for the airline. Last year in this committee, I presented a list of 67 service providers that are waiting to be punished for their support, material support to an entity sanctioned under Executive Order 13224. That is the kind of action that
Okay.
U.S. government can take.
Ms. Rosenberg, wrap it up. I'm over my time here, so go ahead and finish your statement if you would.
There is an opportunity by looking further down the value chain. However, if the United States only relies on sanctions, then we will be missing an opportunity, because as has been pointed out before, if institutions are just looking at a list and making sure that their clients aren't on a list, then we are missing everyone that is behind those front companies and that are the broader networks that are doing the proliferation activity.
We'll try to delve a little bit more into that later in the hearing, but thank you very much, Mr. Foster. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Ottolenghi, you mentioned rather unambiguously in your testimony that there must be no anonymous companies. Do any of you see any path to success on non-proliferation or prevention of proliferation financing as long as anonymous corporations are allowed?
I can speak to that. I think there's an incredible opportunity before you all today to take action on beneficial ownership, which will have a direct effect in banning anonymous companies. And it is through those companies that an array of financial ills occurs through this financial jurisdiction. And the United States, as a pace setter, as a standard setter for the entire global community, must lead and demonstrate that anonymity in companies through which proliferation can occur is unacceptable.
Any other comments on that? Is there any, is
couldn't
logic
agree.
just that simple?
I couldn't agree more. Most of the networks I've studied over the years involving proliferation and money laundering for terror finance all relied on opaque jurisdictions and anonymous companies and beneficial ownership. It is a critical tool for their action, and we should definitely advocate and promote more transparency.
And which countries besides the United States are going to have to clean up their act on this?
A vast number of jurisdictions in the Caribbean basin are an obvious place to start. Jurisdictions that are under U.S. sovereignty, such as the Marshall Islands, jurisdictions in Europe, small countries like Monaco, Andorra, Liechtenstein. These are places, the British Isles that are not direct part of the United Kingdom, such as the Isle of Man, such as the Channel Islands. All of these are places that are being used and abused for this type of activity.
If I may add to this, there are a handful of companies that have, rather, countries that have received good marks on beneficial ownership of all of them, which is to say, this is just perhaps the example of some of the most egregious. Everyone, including those jurisdictions of greatest proliferation concern through which we know proliferation transactions are flowing, have an opportunity and indeed a national security obligation to do more to identify the beneficial owners behind corporate structures.
Yeah, and Mr. Albright, what would it take for the United States to get a perfect score? Well, what are the top 5 ways that we blow our grade?
In 2017, the United States was #1. So I mean, we have a fairly tough standard. I mean, they're not fully compliant on FATF recommendations. You know, there's money laundering issues. There's illicit flows of money that are at issue. So I think the way the United States can improve, and our index is pretty much in the weeds, but it did do the best of any country, and it kind of says that overall.
So do we have the highest score despite allowing anonymous shell corporations?
Well, those are the kinds of things that would lower the score. I mean, the score
All right, it
was
seems like that
60
should
out of
like blow your
100.
score completely.
I'm sorry?
It seems like that should blow your score completely.
Well, everything is weighted, and everything is, there's a lot of parts to this. I mean, that's one important aspect, but there's many others, and I think, and I don't want to beat up on the United States because we see much, much worse behavior in most of the world. And the United States, even though it has room for improvement, is still doing the best and is carrying the water for most of the improvements that are sought in countering financial proliferation.
Okay. What country besides the United States do you think gets it the best? You know, if you could say the world should adopt the standards of X, what would X be?
Well, I think I think European Union, those countries tended to rank much better than others. And
Do they allow anonymous shell corporations in the EU?
I don't know, do they? I
So
think
we have a transparent company register in the United Kingdom, as opposed to the Caribbean islands that were mentioned. I would say, as someone not from these shores, the fact that the US allows such opacity in company ownership does not do the reputation, or at least the message that the United States tries to deliver internationally on illicit finance, does not help that message get taken on board by countries that can turn around and say, but hang on a minute, you have this kind of opacity in the United States.
Yeah, and are anonymous land transactions a big part of the problem, both in the US and worldwide? That's something that countries are split on. Some allow that, some don't.
So for illicit finance in general, clearly the ability to own property in an anonymous fashion is a huge problem. It's a huge problem in the United Kingdom and a huge problem elsewhere. Specific to proliferation finance, I don't know the answer to that.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pittenger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for coming today, for your expertise. It's very valued and appreciated. One of the outcomes of the Jcpoa was the allowing Iranian banks through the SWIFT authority to operate. How serious of an outcome is that?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat what did you say?
The Iranian banks that can operate under the SWIFT authority as an outcome of the Jcpoa. How would you rank, or what concern do you have for that outcome?
Yeah, I can answer. Manuel can too. I mean, fortunately, the Iranian banks are tied into illicit procurement networks. So by removing the sanctions, it also made it much easier for those banks to continue or expand illicit activity.
Would reimposing the element that allowed those banks and preventing them from operating as they weren't not able to prior to that agreement, would that assist in our efforts?
Well,
I can speak to that. For example, the United States has plans to reimpose sanctions removed on implementation day under the Jcpoa. That will involve putting back on the list, presumably, those Iranian banks that were de-designated. So having them back on the U.S. SDN list means that, and because of the secondary nature of them, any country or company or person anywhere in the world providing material support to those SDN entities will face enforcement actions for those sanctions. That has the effect of de-swifting those same banks.
Thank you. Mr. Adelenge, you mentioned Uganda and several other countries who are not engaged with us. Is that, let me clarify, was that a matter of will or the lack of capabilities? I know OTA works with certain countries to help them enhance their capabilities in their financial systems. Egypt, for example, right now is really responding to be very supportive with OTA. So is our concern out there in the field with other countries, with our allies, the lack of interest or the lack of technical capabilities and software?
I think it's a mixture of both, usually. You will find good political will, but lack of capacity in some countries, and plenty of capacity and lack of political will in others. And one country that comes to mind where there is capacity but there is no will is Turkey.
Yep.
Turkey is a country where in November 2012, at the height of the sanction regime, Iran had approximately 2,600 companies incorporated through foreign direct investment, many of which linked to the regime. Today, that number has skyrocketed to, I quote the exact figure in my written statement, I think is around 4,600.
Quickly,
So
how many countries do you see out there that, given the right capabilities, technology, and software, would they be willing to raise their standards and their collaboration with us? How short are we in the process of fully engaging the willing countries to be supportive and giving the technology they need?
Again, I think it's a question of allocation of resources and prioritizing. And the challenge in some of these countries are quite frankly overwhelming. It's not just improving their ability to conduct effective anti-money laundering and counterterrorism compliance in the banks. It's about better training and providing technology to border controls and customs. The challenge is large and big, and so I think that it should start from testing the political will of these countries to engage in programs that can improve their ability to enforce sanctions and cooperate better with the United States.
As you know, we host these forums for Parliament members. We just had one in Berlin this past week, and we found the private sector is a very important element. The banks, the software companies, and others that have come in. And after one such meeting we had in Buenos Aires, 100 members of one company went down and became very supportive with Argentina to try to get them up to speed. And I think what I'm trying to determine is how much opportunity do we have out there that OTA could be better engaged with those who want to participate in a stronger way.
If I may, we require the private sector to implement these sanctions and so on our behalf. Talking to governments and expecting governments in many of these countries to communicate that effectively to their private sector is frankly, if not a fool's errand, then extremely difficult to do. So you really need to engage with the banks and others in these countries to bring to their attention what they should be being told by their own governments.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the neighboring state to New Mexico to the west, Ms. Sinema, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pearson. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for being with us today. As residents of a border state, Arizonans are deeply concerned about the national security threats we face. Rogue states and terrorist organizations are developing weapons of mass destruction that threaten our homeland. Drug cartels like Sinaloa and other international criminal syndicates traffic illegal weapons across our southern border and endanger our communities. We must be tough and smart to combat these threats. Secure borders and a strong military, enduring and collaborative relationships with our allies, and strategically applied sanctions are all essential tools to keep us safe from the likes of North Korea, ISIS, and other dangerous entities. We must do more. Cracking down on weapons proliferation is essential to our national security, and that's why I worked with Congressman Tipton of Colorado to introduce H.R. 6332, the Improving Strategies to Counter Weapons Proliferation Act. Our legislation improves the federal government's ability to stop the financing of rogue states, transnational criminal organizations, and terrorist groups. Our bill facilitates development of intelligence products that financial institutions, the intelligence community, and law enforcement can use to identify and stop transactions linked to weapons proliferation. We shouldn't let a terrorist organization get away with building a dirty bomb or chemical weapon because our government wasn't using all of the tools at its disposal. And we must do everything possible to keep Arizona families safe. With that, I have 2 questions for Ms. Rosenberg with the Center for a New American Security. My first question, Ms. Rosenberg, our bill's reporting requirement improves the types of intelligence products FinCEN offers to financial institutions. Given your expertise, could you elaborate on the kinds of unique insights that FinCEN has that financial institutions, the intelligence community, and law enforcement might not have on their own?
The information that FinCEN gathers as supplied to it by all manner of reporting institutions, banks first and foremost among them, money services business, important in border states in particular, brings together information on suspicious activity and cash movements. And when this information is aggregated in FinCEN and as accessible by the law enforcement community and intelligence community, there's an opportunity to look broadly for trends here. This may include structuring or other activities, the footprint of which you can see for drug cartel activity, for example, or other illicit activity. Now, there are plenty of authorities and opportunities for FinCEN to gather this information, to analyze it, for the law enforcement community to do that, and to use these intelligence products to go after these concerns in various ways, with sanctions, with law enforcement activity. But I will offer that the United States would be in a better position. FinCEN data would be better. There would be even more reporting to FinCEN if there was more disclosure about the entities, the companies, and the entities that are doing these cash transactions, that are making these financial wire transactions. So with more information, for example, with the beneficial ownership requirements that this committee has put forward in draft form in this Congress, that information in the FinCEN database, accessible to the law enforcement and intelligence community, would be even better.
Thank you. My second question is related to illegal small arms and light weapons that are trafficked across our southern border. This is a dangerous and persistent problem in my state of Arizona. The flow of these weapons across the border is often carried out by violent drug cartels like the Sinaloa, who threaten communities all across our state. We must be doing more to stop groups like Sinaloa and their cross-border trade in humans, drugs, and weapons. So how could FinCEN's intelligence products assist law enforcement in cracking down on these drug cartels? And could these intelligence products be useful in helping financial institutions combat structuring, which cartels like Sinaloa use to avoid our current anti-money laundering regime?
You brought up a good point about cross-border money flows related to small arms and other criminal activity across the border. Right now, the United States doesn't have a requirement for reporting cross-border financial transactions. That's something that Australia and Canada do, and it's been the basis for those countries to track illicit activity, including proliferation finance, which is the topic of this hearing today. If the United States were to pursue that, and it has been floated, that idea has been floated. There's been a draft law, if you will, in the form of a rule that has been put out and considered, but not taken forward. That kind of requirement would be a huge asset for the kind of cross-border criminal activity, including small arms transfers and the money moving with them, to address that threat.
Thank you so much, Chairman. My time has expired.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rothfuss for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ottolenghi, Iran and its terror proxy Hezbollah are currently engaged in hostile or criminal actions around the world, and most notably against Israel and her allies. The Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the JCPOA was wise, in my opinion. Before the JCPOA, when nuclear-related sanctions were in place in Iran, was there an increased awareness on Iran's illicit procurement efforts?
Based on my research, which is all open source, I can tell you that two things. One, that Iran's proliferation networks, which pre-existed the JCPOA, and which, if Iran had intended to genuinely, dismantle it or walk away from its nuclear weapons ambitions and rejoin the community, international community, as a responsible player, those networks would have been dismantled, would have been taken apart, would have been shut down. We have evidence that none of that happened, that those networks continue to be active, and networks that were targeted by sanctions prior to the JCPOA have been reconstituted in some cases. So that gives you a sense of the intention. The second point is that, of course, Iran's proxies have continued and even expanded dramatically their efforts to continue to raise cash through cooperation with criminal cartels across the world, from Latin America to West Africa, in an effort to finance their terrorism and their military activities in the Middle East. So on both accounts, you can see that the JCPOA has not in any way pushed Iran to become more responsible on either proliferation or terror finance.
Has there been any evidence of Iran seeking illicit goods or technology outside agreed-upon channels since the JCPOA went into effect in January 2016?
By all means, yes. I believe that the latest UN report on this matter highlights a number of procurement attempts that were done outside the procurement channel organized by the JCPOA. We are aware of some procurement attempts of what we think is dual-use technology. We cannot share it publicly, but I'd be happy to brief the members in private. There is, by all means, plenty of evidence that Iran has continued to seek technology that could be put to use for nefarious purposes.
What impact will President Trump's May 8th, 2018 announcement of the exit of the U.S. from the JCPOA have on proliferation financing?
Well, I think that you will see, as I said, ramped up attempts by Iran to procure and also to just evade sanctions on a broad front in order to keep its own economy afloat. I think that there are two differences between the situation now, the current situation, and the situation before 2006, when the UN sanctions regime began and so created the international consensus for economic pressure against Iran. The first is that, of course, this time the United States right now does not have the international community going along with it on withdrawing from the JCPOA. But on the other hand, you have 10 years of experience of US secondary sanctions that are very vividly in the mind of the international financial sector, the business community, and so on. And we are seeing already that regardless of steps taken and countermeasures by the European Union or other countries that want to preserve the JCPOA, the vast majority of global business is walking away from Iran because they just do not want to take the risk of finding themselves on the wrong side of U.S. authorities.
A recent staff report from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations revealed that, contrary to congressional testimony of Obama-era officials, the U.S. Department of the Treasury authorized a specific license allowing a conversion of $5.7 billion in oil revenue held by Bank Muscat and Omani Rials to euros, which would necessitate conversion through the U.S. financial system. What do you make of the Treasury Department's issuance of this license?
I really can't speak to this matter or on behalf of the Treasury Department. If any of my colleagues would like to.
Well, let me ask you this. Despite urging from OFAC, 2 U.S. banks declined to convert the money, citing compliance and reputational risk. What implications for proliferation finance could such a conversion have had? Again, 2 U.S. banks declined to convert the money, citing compliance and reputational risk. What implications for proliferation finance could such a conversion, had it taken place, have had?
Well, it would give Iran access to dollars and the ability to transact in dollars. It would give legitimacy to these types of transactions. So the whole purpose of the financial sanctions regime is to deny Iran access to legitimate financial avenues for financial transactions at the global level. The whole idea of de-SWIFTing Iran is not so much that you're going to shut down their banks or prevent them from buying and selling, but it is basically pulling the plug on an international platform that allows for millions of transactions, legitimate transactions on a daily basis. So it makes it extremely difficult for Iran to transact, and it makes it easier for financial institutions to avoid being exposed to these types of transactions. When you allow these transactions to go through, nevertheless, you expose your financial system to reputational risk.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now would recognize gentleman, Mr. Lynch. You've got the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes.
I want to thank the witnesses. Very thoughtful testimony. It is ironic, though, and somewhat counterintuitive. So we talk about these sanctions against Iran and against Russia, but we allow them to set up shell corporations in the United States to purchase property, to purchase aircraft, because we don't have any way of telling who owns the property. So you have Iranians who have bought high-rises in New York City. You got Russian oligarchs that have bought a lot of property in Florida. And because we refuse, we thump our chests every time we assert sanctions. But the reality of the situation is that we don't know who's buying property here in the United States. We don't know who is. We don't have a public registry like the UK. Is that right, Ms. Rosenberg?
I certainly agree that that's an enormous problem. That anonymous companies and the ability for those transactions you've described to occur, as well as the ability for U.S. financial institutions to bank entities, the beneficial owner or the natural person behind which they are not sure. This is an enormous financial crime vulnerability, not just for proliferation finances we're discussing today, but across an array of potential financial criminal activity. And may I add to this?
Sure.
There's a new, as you know, customer due diligence rule that is just gone live. However, I'm concerned by some efforts to slow walk some of the implementation of that, and you all are poised to encourage its urgent implementation. It is one of the few tools available at present, given that there is this massive gap in beneficial ownership information, such as it is, to try and understand who customers are of financial institutions. I would encourage you all to look aggressively at the need to implement it immediately.
Thank you. Mr. Keating, do you think it would be helpful if the United States, as a leader, a global leader, adopted a system where they required people to disclose who they were when they purchase property in the United States or do business here in the United States?
Without doubt. I think you have to put yourself in the position of those countries around the world that are visited by US Treasury officials telling them to do certain things in order to strengthen the integrity of the global financial system. And those things that they are being asked to do are absolutely right. But do what I say, not what I do,
Right.
is often the cry. The other thing I'd like to say is when I arrived here yesterday, I had to show my passport. The United States knew I was coming. I'd filled out all the forms in advance. To Liz's point, I don't think you know what money is coming into this country. We have the same problem in our own country. And that, to me, is a national security issue. If you don't know what money is coming into this country, you don't know how that money is then going to be used to manipulate this country. So understanding what money is entering your country, I think, is an important security consideration. Forget money laundering.
Thank you. I think we're the laggards in this, speaking for the United States in our financial system. So you've got the UK, and I think a couple of other countries. Denmark is another one that has a public registry, so you can actually go online and figure out who owns what company or real estate. It's public. And you've got 20 other countries in the EU that have committed to adopting this system. So the world is moving toward this more transparent system, but we here in the United States are keeping this non-transparent, this opaque, corrupt system in operation. So, I know that Ms. Maloney has a bill on beneficial ownership. I have one on aircraft because we have a running problem here where, we had someone affiliated with Hezbollah that actually registered an aircraft. You think after 9/11 would be concerned about that, but we've got Hezbollah registering aircraft here in the United States because we don't require beneficial ownership. So I love the tough talk about the sanctions, but the fact of the matter is we're not doing our job to protect the American people and to protect our financial system because we don't require beneficial ownership information when investments and real estate purchases are made here in the United States. So I thank you for your testimony, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman looking for balance in life. That would be Mr. Poliquin for 5 minutes. It's not a new request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I appreciate it. Gentlemen, a couple of years ago, the House of Representatives voted strongly against the Iran nuclear deal. I was one of the people that voted against that. It then went over to the Senate and never received a vote. I'm sure we all recall that that deal allowed about $150 billion in cash to be released to the folks that run the Iranian regime. It kept the nuclear arms program intact. And this is to a country that chants on a regular basis death to America. So my question to you, and we'll start with you, Mr. Ottolenghi, do you think American families, now we're looking 2 years beyond when that deal was put into effect by the prior administration, do you think American families are less or more safe today as a result of that deal? And why?
A large premise of that deal was that Iran would moderate its behavior and become, over time, a more responsible interlocutor in the region. I think that the evidence is in plain sight that the opposite has happened as a consequence of releasing resources to the Iranian regime, returning Iran from the cold into the fold of the international community. Iran has become more aggressive in its behavior, in its posture, and it has been allowed to wreak havoc in the region even more so than it did before.
So therefore, we would both conclude that
less
American
safe.
families are less safe.
Less safe.
Is that correct? And we were also told that if the United States pulled out of that deal, it would be impossible to reimpose sanctions on the country of Iran. Is that true? And would those sanctions be effective?
The United States doesn't need the rest of the world to have permission to impose or reimpose, expand, elaborate, extend sanctions against Iran. I think that the key will be how credible the threat and the deterrence of sanction is as we move forward. And for that, you need the executive branch to be willing to vigorously enforce sanctions and punish those who will challenge and violate U.S. law.
Mr. Keating, I have introduced a bill in this committee called the Iranian Leaders Asset Transparency Act. You might not be familiar with it. It received a significant bipartisan vote here in the House and has not gone anywhere in the Senate. It effectively looks at the 70 or 80 individuals that run the Iranian government, whether it be political leaders or military leaders. It requires the United States Treasury Department to post on its website the assets that are held by those 70 to 80 individuals, post them in not only English but the 3 languages that are practiced in Iran, such that the world can see the assets accumulated illegally in many cases by these individuals and not reaching their people. Do you think that's a good or a bad idea to show the world how the Iranian people have been ripped off by these folks that chant death to America?
I think the transparency of asset ownership by any politician, any leader, is an important consideration. The posting of that kind of list, you see the impact that the posting of the list of Russian names had, certainly in Europe when Treasury posted that list earlier in the year. People sat up and took note, okay, are these people likely to be subject to sanction by the United States? We perhaps should steer clear with them, and some of them were subsequently sanctioned. But transparency of political leadership, asset ownership anywhere in the world is a critical issue.
Mr. Keating, also to continue, please, are the demonstrations to the best of your ability still continuing in Iran?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Are the demonstrations by the populace in Iran still continuing throughout the country, to your knowledge?
As reported, yes, but I don't know them in detail.
Anybody have any further, Mr. Albright? Ms. Rosenberg, any idea?
I too read about them in the newspapers. I have no personal knowledge of that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You're back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our witnesses today. And Ms. Rosenberg, I want to give you a special thank you and a shout out for all your help through CNAS's assistance with our virtual currency task force legislation, HR 5036. Really appreciate it, so thank you again. And Ms. Rosenberg, as you know, we have financial sanctions on proliferators to stop them from raising and moving money for their nuclear weapons programs. So in your opinion, are these sanctions enough to stop proliferation finance, or is the problem lack of enforcement of these sanctions?
Thank you for the question and your kind words. They're not enough. Sanctions are not enough. And it's not just because there aren't enough sanctions. Surely there's more opportunity to impose more sanctions to expose and go after proliferation activities where it occurs. But as we were discussing earlier, if there is an approach towards proliferation, counter-proliferation activities, just looking at a set of sanctions, it exposes a vulnerability that we have. Because if we know, as we do, that North Korean proliferators, Iranian proliferators are good at using front companies and shell companies and trusted agents who change their names, then it's a near impossible task to keep that list, that sanctions list, up to date so that we can be sure that we are not providing avenues for moving money, for raising money to proliferators. So as the United Nations has pointed out in calling for a broader approach to counter-proliferation activity, counter-proliferation finance, we must look at the nature of the conduct, not just specific entities.
Thank you. So if sanctions are not enough, what would you suggest Congress do to counter this threat?
Well, one set of immediate things that Congress can do and that you all are very well placed to do is to take action to promote transparency for companies, for entities that would use the U.S. financial system, not just to prevent proliferation activities moving through the U.S. financial system. And by the way, we know that is occurring, that North Korea has, even not in the recent past, moved money through the U.S. financial system. So to safeguard our own and also serve as a standard for other jurisdictions internationally. As Tom was just saying, transparency is our friend here, and that can be accomplished through beneficial ownership legislation, through requiring more information in cross-border payments, knowing who brings what kind of money into this country and removes it again, and also in encouraging aggressive implementation of the CDD rule.
So I appreciate you mentioning North Korea. Thank you. And I want to switch over to, on North Korea, to Mr. Albright. Can you discuss how North Korea most regularly accesses the global financial system and, according to Ms. Rosenberg, even the U.S. system?
Well, typically the North Koreans, if they're going to use banks, are going to use Chinese banks. I think one of the challenges has been for administrations to sanction those banks. I mean, obviously China's deeply opposed that, but I think if things don't work out well with North Korea, and I wouldn't give it a 50-50 chance that they will, namely the negotiations succeeding. I think it's very important for Congress to be willing and prepared to pass even harsher sanctions, going after even what Chairman Pierce called going after these kind of second row of sanctions violators. And I think there's been legislation that's been drafted and discussed that could in a sense up the game, because in the end, it's not just a question of going after entities. I mean, the tactics change, countries adapt to the sanctions. So you constantly have to, in a sense, refresh them, think of new ways to improve them. And I think the U.S. Congress, and particularly the House of Representatives, has been a major leader in coming up with new sanctions approaches that have been quite effective.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, just to continue on that, since you narrowed it down to China and their financial institutions, what do they do to help with North Korea's access to critical components and technology? That's something you have insight into?
Well, they haven't done enough. I mean, it's gotten better. I mean, it's better than it was a couple years ago, but the concern now is that some of the actions China took will diminish. I mean, China is North Korea's shopping market, and it's not just Chinese, it's American, German, British, you name it. Companies are there, and they are selling goods to China, and the North Koreans are masters at acquiring fairly sensitive goods for their nuclear and missile programs and to be able to exploit China's weak export controls. Now, they did clamp down, and that was a positive sign, but there are some signs that they're weakening, and I think if things don't go well, one of the things that's going to have to be done is to make sure that China understands that it can no longer be a marketplace for the North Korean WMD and missile programs.
Thank you. My time has expired, but before I yield, if you would add in any of your further answers that you're able to, just anything you would suggest to the legislative branch or the executive branch that we could do to address some of these shortcomings. So thank you again. I yield back.
Thank you, and just for those of you still here, it's the chair's intention to go to a second round, and I think that's going to be the focus of the round, if you can hang around. The New Mexico neighbor to the north, now Mr. Tipton, Colorado, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel for taking the time to be here. I think we've had a pretty evident case lined out, particularly the doctor had lined out some of the complex webs that we see in terms of being able to create shell corporations that are going to be able to seek financing. But part of the challenge, obviously, is when you get those smaller-sized corporations, we do get into the financial institutions that are facing some reputational risk, institutional risk when it comes to, frankly, funding illicit firearms and weapons with perhaps not even the knowledge that they're actually doing that. And Ms. Rosenberg, if you maybe speak to, really here in the U.S. we have a pretty robust system to be able to identify and counter some of the illicit finance that does go on. But when it comes to our smaller financial institutions, do you believe that there's an actual awareness that exists in some of the contemporary realities that we really face with the proliferation finance and the threats that they have?
It's certainly true that the biggest institutions in the United States, or I should start by saying the United States is best in class when it comes to identifying potential proliferation activities, to analyzing this, to taking law enforcement or sanctions action. That said, it's not enough. We still witness a North Korean nuclear program that is very dangerous and scary, so we must do more, even if the United States is best in class. And there's a few institutions that sit atop that best-in-class status. Some of the major U.S. global banks, financial institutions, and corporations are excellent they have their own financial intelligence units, able to try and proactively look for patterns of proliferation and communicate that directly to our law enforcement community. We are in their debt, those two constituencies. However, these smaller companies that you've mentioned, or financial institutions, regional credit unions, we have seen in a number of instances they don't have the staff, the awareness, the compliance culture to recognize when certain kinds of financial abuse comes through their system. However, not all of them have direct international relationships, for example. They must go through some of these bigger money center banks in order to conduct that. That becomes a kind of a check on their activities, but it's really up to the federal and state level banking supervisors and regulators to help them to understand and to follow the law such as it is and to identify and stop that proliferation activity where it may occur and affect them.
Do you have some direct suggestions along those lines? You know, you'd spoken a little bit to transparency, obviously. We understand certainly some of the correspondent banking connectivity that's going to be there, but just being able, some actions that the smaller institutions institutionally could take, or is it simply a matter of scale, size, and dollars?
And understanding risk. So the United States has a risk-based approach to its financial supervision. And the Fed, the OCC, that oversee the biggest financial institutions and those they supervise have a rock-solid understanding of what that looks like. But risk is different for different institutions. Of course, there are smaller regional banks in the United States that have much broader exposure to Latin America, for example. So even while they're not those biggest money center banks, if they should have a good sense of their risk, who is coming to Miami? Who is placing structured transactions in the United States and buying anonymously real estate in that market? If they understand their risk well, and that is up to their regulators at the state level and at the federal level to help them calibrate their risk appropriately, that's something that that's a banner we should raise and say, understand the particular risk you have with your footprint and your orientation for your financial activities. It's different for every financial institution.
Would you maybe share with us a couple of your thoughts just focus a little bit on the SARS reports and that American banks are required to be able to submit to FinCEN? And do you think that we have sufficient information about how the SARS reports are used by law enforcement to be able to combat proliferation financing?
Do you have sufficient information? Well, I don't know what kind of briefings that FinCEN gives to you. I would encourage you to have a full and frank conversation with them. It's not just them because they administer the BSA and collect it. And I think any law enforcement officer looking at terrorism finance or proliferation finance might take issue that these SARs are FinCEN SARs. They belong to the entire law enforcement and intelligence community, and they should be so empowered to have access to them and to use them jointly.
This can probably just be yes or no, but do you think it'd be helpful to know more about what kinds of suspicious activity reports, what they use the actions for when the reports are made?
Yes, on proliferation finance, because it will signal to them that you care. It will give a demand signal to them and the financial institutions that they oversee that must submit the SARs to know that this is a priority that they must look for and take action on.
Great. Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Before I recognize Mr. Davidson, I would like to inquire of our panels if you're able to stay around for a second round as your time will allow that. Also, and direct for us as members, what I'm going to do on this next round. What I'm going to do on this next round, after we're going to take the two more with 5 questions each, and then I think there's a consensus among the minority and majority that we would really like to hear from you specific suggestions, and so we're going to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 with one specific, and if your specific is sort of general, and not picking on you, Ms. Rosenberg, but you said if we were going to do something, it's got to be on transparency, then give us 2 things on transparency. I'll give you 1 big item and 2 sub-items, and then I would like the questions to delve into this where we see from a policymaker's point of view what it is that these experts are suggesting that we do. If we want to ratchet up the pressure on this financing of weapons of mass destruction, 1 or 2 notches. I mean, we can reach for the sky, but it's not going to happen between now and the end of the year. We might get a specific bill with specific recommendations that is lightning quick. And if you got one chance to do something before the session ends, what would you do? So that's where we're going after the 2 5-minutes here. So please be prepared, got to be concise. We got a vote series coming up. Mr. Davidson, make it good 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for our witnesses. And Mr. Albright, it's great to have an Ohio-educated Wright State grad in the room, which is not in the district but adjacent, and Oberlin, also a great Ohio education system. And I assume the rest of you, by your resumes, are all sufficiently well-educated as well. Thanks for your expertise in the matter. But I want to spend a little bit of time specifically dealing with Iran and the threat of weapons of mass destruction, weapons proliferation in Iran, but also how they might deploy them. Under the previous administration, as part of negotiating the JCPOA, there was Operation Cassandra, activities involving fundraising, potentially other activities, and I just wonder if, I apologize for the potential error in your name, Mr. Ottolenghi. Could you address that?
Absolutely. Iran remains the main sponsor financially of Hezbollah. But over the past decade or so, Hezbollah's budget has grown exponentially and dramatically for its needs because of its involvement in Syria after 2011, because of its obligation to reconstruct the destroyed south of Lebanon after the war in 2006, while Iran's contribution has become unreliable due to the increased pressure of sanctions. So Hezbollah has developed networks and cooperation with criminal syndicates across the globe to finance its activities through this type of convergence. Narco-terrorism is the word most commonly used. This activity is yielding, in our conservative estimate at FTD, based on open source research done by some of my colleagues, to about $300 million a year out of an estimated budget of about $1 billion a year. People who were involved in the Project Cassandra over a decade would probably estimate that the contribution to Hezbollah's finances through this type of illicit activities is dramatically larger. So we're talking about a global criminal syndicate that cooperates with local criminal syndicates, affecting the security and the well-being of our societies. This is not just a national security issue. It's about, you know, our neighborhoods and our lifestyle and the safety of society.
Yep. If we look at how they're doing this, not just what they're doing, how much of this is conventional movement of money, wire transfers and whatnot between Iran and proxy groups, and how much is moved by Hawala networks or cash?
I don't have accurate estimates, but I can say, based on my research, that a significant part of these funding activities go through trade-based money laundering that is conducted through front companies, transacting through and with the assistance of regular banking institutions, money exchange houses, but it is mostly wired into the formal global financial system. And a lot of it goes through the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, one of the things that we were wrestling with is because of these front companies, knowing the beneficial ownership. And if all this data was used for good purposes to only catch criminals, there would still be a burden of who has to collect it and monitor it. In the current system, the government has effectively nationalized parts of our banks and commissioned them as law enforcement officers to collect lots of data. While this data, And, okay, my mic's back. Well, this data is very valuable to national security. Some approaches would have the burden shifted from banks out to every company, that there's reporting requirements that they fill out every year over and above the other forms and documents that they fill out every year. What's your best recommendation as we prepare to transition into? How might we best know the beneficial ownership of corporations in balancing the right to privacy that is perhaps unique to America because of the Fourth Amendment?
Yeah, I think the transparency is important, and it's been discussed probably better than I can do by other witnesses. I mean, I would add, though, that we don't have a good system here for companies to report like banks do. I mean, there's all kinds of suspicious transactions that occur, and the system has not been established here as it has been, let's say, in Britain and Germany, for companies to easily pass on those suspicious reports. I mean, FBI, ICE do a great job of collecting things, but we don't have a routine system like the SARS system.
Where we do for banks. Thank you, and valid point. Hopefully that informs our debate going forward, and my time has expired. I yield, Chairman.
Gentleman's time is expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Emmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chair. Thanks to the panel. Kind of following up on where my colleague and my friend, Mr. Davidson, was headed, I have major concerns, even though the area that we're trying to address today is incredibly important to our national security. I think you can become a prisoner of your need for security. And I really am troubled at the tone that suggests that U.S. citizens should give up more of their privacy rights, and that private entities, my colleague just said banks, being nationalized as part of the federal law enforcement. They become an extension of federal law enforcement activities. And it sounds, even from the panel at times, as though the United States is the problem, when in fact this is about third-party facilitators. This is about countries and entities in other countries that they're breaking the law. And we need to focus on them and figure out how we stop them from doing that. The best example was North Korea earlier. The problem isn't North Korea. We know North Korea is going to break the law. The problem is China, or anyone that would aid North Korea in that activity. I'm not saying that I'm adamantly opposed to doing certain things on our end, but it seems to me that should be the secondary phase. The focus should be on those that are committed to breaking the law, supporting international criminals, crime networks, terrorists, and the proliferation issue that we're talking about. So, Ms. Rosenberg, I think somebody commented or started to go into this a little earlier. Do you believe that our banks currently understand the contemporary realities of the proliferation, late in the day, finance threats that they face?
Thank you for the question. A number of the big U.S. and biggest global banks certainly understand the nature of the threat. And what should be concerning to us is that even when they understand it, they know that they may be incapable of getting after it. If, for example, they're asked to host a set of transactions, if they're looking at a particular customer, and or maybe they host a lot of or facilitate a lot of shipping transactions. If they're given a list by the U.S. Coast Guard of vessels that may be involved in ship-to-ship transfers, maybe, and they have to make a decision about whether they should provide services to the shipping agent or the flagging registry, what decision are they to make? They have inadequate information. That's the concerning part. So even the people who know that they have inaccurate information, which is to say nothing about those who are committed to breaking the law, and we know are utterly unconcerned about facilitating, maybe willing to facilitate proliferation activities.
So that goes to the next question, which I think the chairman touched on a little bit early in this questioning, and it goes to what you just talked about. So they're given a list by U.S. Customs. If banks screen against sanctions lists, not necessarily the type that you just said, but that could be included, I suppose, does that put them in a position to understand whether or not proliferation is, that they're involved? Or is that the whole topic of this hearing, is that they can't be sure that that's what they're dealing with? Does that make sense?
Yes, perhaps I'd put it this way. If they find a hit, an entity, and they do, all major global banks, not just US banks, major regional banks, adopt sanctions lists from the United States, the United Nations, et cetera. They are screening transactions against this list. If they get a hit and it's a known proliferator, they could realistically assume that they have a much bigger problem than one person who tripped.
Right.
And even if they say, understanding their obligation is not to provide material support to that entity and close their account, they may know that that person will go down the road and open an account at the next bank. So they're aware of the problem. They have some limited tools, and in certain jurisdictions where these banks are prevented from talking to one another about proliferation activity they notice in their own ledger of accounts, that is a problem.
Well, that's a great point. And I was going to ask you, because it would have led into the next question, what are the gaps in the financial institutions' responses to counter proliferation finance? But I've run out of time, and perhaps after the hearing we can kind of follow up with the people with the panelists. I really appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Okay, now then we're going to shift the process just a bit here. You see the hustle over in the corner there. Each one of you are going to get one statement up there, okay? So it needs to be kind of tight. So you're going to put your statement up there. If it's a general statement like transparency, then you're going to have an A and a B under it. Fair enough? And then we're going to try to probe that from this side, because we're the ones that have to try to figure out the policy. You all know the process, and you know everything. So we're just trying to take a very big leap today. We're running out of legislative time in the year. If we're going to do anything in this year, it's got to be very quick. So we're just going to go right down the road. Mr. Albright, and this is going to be much more open here, not the 5 minutes. If you got questions from this end, then flag me and let me know. But let's get the statements up there. Mr. Albright, what would your statement be?
All right.
And Molly's got to keep up with you.
I mean, I would say, first of all, the government, I mean, Congress should require a report from the executive branch on revising the reporting under SARS, how to educate the banks. They don't understand the goods, but again, am I speaking too quickly?
I'd be helping on that.
Yeah,
so help her out, help get the text exactly right up here. We're taking steps that would generally take us weeks to get this done. Okay.
Review SARS and other reporting requirements by financial institutions. And develop methods for banks to better understand the strategies being used by illicit networks and the goods that are being sought.
All right, does that got you close enough? The script, get us a little bit bigger font if you can over there. We're going to let you come back. Okay, there we go. And you can read it right behind you if you want. It's a little bit.
The SARS, what's in the SARS. I mean, an example would be, I don't think there's a box on SARS where you check that there's suspect activity related to proliferation.
All right. So make sure we have it right. We'll come back and tighten it up after we get everybody in kind of a generalized. So are you ready to move on to the second one? Molly, you ready to go? Christine, excuse me, I'm getting mixed up here. Mr. Keating, you ready to go on your statement?
So I would suggest that the U.S., the right body, you have to apologize, my knowledge of your system is not as it should be. You have Section 314A and 314B of the USA Patriot Act, which allows for information sharing from the public sector, the government, to the private sector. We should be seeing that actively used to share information with the private sector such that they can actually understand the threat that they are trying to counter. So information sharing needs to be the cornerstone of this initiative.
Okay, let her catch up just a bit here. So that's, somebody help out down there, 314A and B. Let's
314A and B of the Patriot Act.
Use them more actively, and you had much more descriptive language there. Go ahead.
To to ensure that the financial system is able to combat the threat of proliferation finance.
All right, Mr. Davidson, I expect a question here in a minute, but we're going to get all four. Okay, you're going to see the process playing out. Right, Mr. Ottolenghi, now tell me again what you just passed some significant roadblock or some hurdle in your quest for permanent status here. Tell us what that is, and we're going to give you a big round of applause here.
It's commonly called the green card.
Yes, okay, all right. Big round.
Came
Okay.
yesterday.
Congratulations, thanks
Thank
for
you.
working through that, and we appreciate you being here.
It's an honor, and it's an honor and a privilege to
Well,
have it.
we
and
thank
I'm
you.
very
All right,
grateful for
what's
that.
your statement?
My statement is that the United States should address urgently Iran's abuse of foreign passports by denying access to the visa waiver program to any country that sells its citizenship for investment. And it could make exceptions if countries are willing to share on an ongoing basis names and due diligence packages done on those to whom they sold their passports. This is a technique that the Iranians have used in order to evade sanctions established from companies. It speaks again to the issue of transparency, and I think that by leveraging this tool, the United States would devalue this
A
program
little
to
slower,
discourage people.
She's a little slower. She's running a little bit behind you. Those Italian guys, they will run fast.
I got very passionate
Take a
about
look.
this
Take a
issue.
look at the script and tell her what you need to fill in, and look behind you if you can't see it. Yeah, you got the script here behind you and on the side. So take a look and see what we need to get to catch
Yes.
your idea completely.
So the United States should address Iran's abuse of foreign passports by denying access to the visa waiver program, the program that allows people to apply for a visa electronically.
Yeah, any country that allows
country that sells its citizenship.
Yeah, Iran will be the main focus, but any country that does this, that sells or facilitates the
Citizenship,
illegal use of passports, should be denied access to the visa waiver program or any other.
No, not the illegal use, but that they sell their citizenship through investment programs.
Okay.
In other words, people who, instead of taking up residency, like I just did, just bring money in, and in exchange, within a matter of weeks or months, become citizens of that country.
Okay.
Yeah, could you give us a brief list of the countries that currently do that?
There is a number of Caribbean nations. The most
Canada, for
the
example?
best known ones is St. Kitts and Nevis, which was actually the target of a FinCEN advisory in May 2014. And the advisory spoke to the fact that this program was being abused by Iranian citizens with the purpose of evading sanctions. Other countries in the region, the Republic of the Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, but also other countries, including Malta, member of the European Union, which has recently created an investment program to give people citizenship. And it has become the center of a very dramatic case involving money laundering for Iran by an Iranian national with a St. Kitts and Nevis passport that was recently detained at Dulles International Airport upon coming into the country in March of 2018.
Okay, we need to keep Ms. Rosenberg.
Mr. Chairman, in your bill, H.R. 6068, Section 10, please transform the study requirement on beneficial ownership to a binding requirement to collect and report beneficial ownership in the corporate formation process.
Okay, you got it, Christine?
This would be as the corporations are established or on an ongoing basis with the duty to report any change?
I would love both. I will take the first.
Okay. And by the way, we're deep in discussion today after talking to Secretary Mnuchin on that one section of the bill to make it much tighter, but that's okay. So now I would like for you, each of you four, to take a look, and if you want to, we've just got them in random order. If you agree that any of these should be placed to the top of the list, that you look at someone else's statement and think that should be at the top of the list, I'd like for y'all to reorient those now, and then we're going to go to kind of questions from up here. So,
Can we edit ours? I mean,
say again?
Can we edit them, or should we do that after?
Yeah, what's he? Yeah, please do, yeah, edit, and this is the time where you should really get it more accurate. It's the reason we're putting them up here, exactly for that reason, yes.
Can I add, all right,
Christine, can you follow what he's saying there?
From executive branch to review the information sought in the SARS.
SOUGHT, S-O-U-G-H-T. Sorry.
Sought in the SARS from banks and other FIs, and how to more effectively, how to more effectively educate FIs to better understand strategies.
All right, any other, this is precisely the reason we got it here, because again, this process would take weeks, trust me, between you all and us, just the way it works. Any other amendments? Anybody want to tighten it up? You want to amend it?
I'll amend
Sure.
briefly. I will take your excellent suggestion, Mr. Ranking Member, and add not just upon incorporation, but let's be sure that we're following it on a continuing basis. So evaluating beneficial ownership.
All right, Christine, you getting that?
Thank you.
Make sure we got it. Is that good?
Yeah, I think there's a grammar problem. You could put "and" on a continuing basis.
Yeah, yes. Right, which articles of incorporation for a small company can change tomorrow. My wife and I own the company, and when we bought it, we changed from complete ownership here to one person to us, and if it's not on an ongoing basis, then we haven't done it. So, all right, so everybody kind of comfortable here? All right, Mr. Davidson, I know you already have a question on 314A and B. Ask the question, push just a bit, a light bit, sir. Anyway.
Well, yeah, so, 314A and B, and the Patriot Act really stretched the bounds of U.S. privacy protections. Not something that the UK seems to enjoy or appreciate much, but I can appreciate from the intelligence gathering perspective why we would want to share this information. But let me illustrate some of the activities that happened in the U.S. and how do we get this balance right in your estimation. The safeguards are important. So under the previous administration, there were reputational risk directives given by regulators that said, we really don't think you should bank this company because they sell weapons or something, which is perfectly legal in the United States, but not appreciated by the previous administration. So companies that had strong balance sheets were told that because of reputational risk, we can't bank you. That meant that they lost access to that bank. Once you start sharing all the information across the market, these are law-abiding companies that could face a scenario where they're not just locked out of their current bank, they're locked out of the U.S. banking system. When we're targeting illicit finance, we want these people to be locked out of the U.S. system to the extent that we want to block their actions from happening. And we want them to use the U.S. financial system so that we can actually detect their activities. So it's a paradox there. How do we get this right and protect the things that we established and supported in the Patriot Act while protecting our founding documents and principles?
So the issue of de-risking that you refer to is something that I have studied extensively, and it's not just weapons companies, it's charities, money service businesses, et cetera, et cetera. At the heart of much of this the de-risking, and I don't know the case you refer to, but at the heart of much of the de-risking is a lack of knowledge and understanding on the part of the banking system. Charities are a risk, okay? We get rid of all charities. What about if you were told charities X, Y, and Z for this demonstrated reason are a risk? Okay, then we don't get rid of all charities, we just get rid of charity X, Y, and Z. And so we have something in the United Kingdom called the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, which is a task force of banks and the government sit together and talk about financial crime risk in a way that makes the financial system in the UK understand the nature of the risk that the government sees, that the authorities see, in a more effective way than simply just saying we're not going to deal with anybody from country X or country Y. So the risk that you point out is an entirely fair risk, but that's why this has to be done as a partnership rather than just a direction from the state to say these kind of blanket bans. Why is it that company X or company Y presents a risk? And the way that the way I would categorize this is that historically, the financial system and governments have operated a parent-child relationship. Thou shalt file a suspicious activity report, and you won't get any feedback, by the way. Okay? Well, we have to continue to have that relationship, but there's also a partnership relationship which needs to be developed. And for the complex, challenging issues like proliferation finance, we will fail until we embrace partnership, because the banks will never be able to solve this on their own. So channels for sharing information in the appropriate way should be encouraged so that we don't get this kind of blanket knee-jerk reaction such as de-risking.
Mr. Foster.
Can I add to this? Can I add to this? Because it actually, in the commodity world, I mean, it's the same problem. If you just go through and do your, in a sense, your corporate compliance responsibilities, if you just go and do it by a sanctions list, you may meet the letter of the law, but you're not going to accomplish anything. I mean, you need to apply some intelligence to it internally, and that's often missing in the banks. But unfortunately, what complicates it here is that, and you see it also on the commodity side, is that the United States system puts roadblocks in the way of government intelligence sharing, and that doesn't exist in Britain, doesn't exist in Germany, a system I'm much more familiar with.
Let's move to Mr. Foster, and then if you can hold that comment, if you can.
You need to change the law to allow, and from the reports we get from the U.S. intelligence community, you have to change the law to more mandate the intelligence community to share information with commercial industry on these key kinds of non-proliferation
Mr. Foster, thanks.
Questions.
Yeah, this is something that we actually get into on the whole issue of the consolidated audit trail, on a related thing with it, which in its eventual plan will have beneficial owner identified behind every stock trade that's made. You know, which there's all sorts of interesting money laundering strategies having to do with international stock trades, where you agree to lose money in this market and win money in this market in a different country, and very complicated things are possible and maybe even being done. And the only way that the regulators are able to imagine dealing with that is to have, in the fullness of time, for every completed trade, and in fact every bid and offer, the beneficial owner identified behind that. And moreover, only the regulator that sees everything can net it out. You can't ask one broker to identify whether or not there's some sort of weird manipulation going on based on the fraction of the data they see. Similarly, a bank may see completely legitimate, operations from everything they can see, and not know that the prices are bogus for, the goods that are being traded. And so that ultimately, if you have to solve this problem, it gets more and more intrusive. And so my question, eventually, the only system that you can write down that will work is that the government sees every financial transaction in the place, which smells a lot like China, where, certainly on the commercial side, where everyone pays by cell phone and everyone assumes the government sees every dime that's spent by consumers in China. And, we seem to be, when you're trying to write a system that might work, you rapidly are led down that road. There has to be some single entity that can run massive software, because no set of humans can do this, massive software to look for patterns of suspicious activity. And they have to have access to everything from all countries. And boy, that scares me. Is there any way out of that conundrum, or is that really the only kind of system that will eventually work?
I think there is a way. I mean, I think, again, I don't want to oversell it, but I know on the idea of government industry cooperation, one way around that is to actually have it. I mean, in our country, it's much too dominated by, in a sense, it's police officers, whether FBI, showing up with handcuffs in their pocket, and they're the ones being having the discussion with the banks or the companies. And it's intimidating. It should be the intelligence system. It can be I hate to use the word affront. I mean, we have, you want to get around some of the quirks of our system, but you want to have a discussion between our best intelligence people and the people who are dealing with the financial system and also with the goods that these proliferant states. And that gets around a lot of this. And I think Britain has done an excellent job on this. And I don't think they're
Well, in Britain, does the government have access to all financial transactions if it wants to see them?
No, it doesn't. I mean, obviously it can.
So there's a de minimis threshold, and so how do you avoid large numbers of under de minimis threshold type transactions, for example, unless you can someone has to add them up?
So the way the UK is trying to develop this is by involving the financial sector in discussions around certain forms of threat, whether it's human trafficking, terrorist finance, whatever it might be, educating the financial sector on what to look for, and then wanting them to go back into their systems and say, right, given this information, this understanding, this guidance we've been given by law enforcement or by intelligence services, now let's interrogate our data ourselves. So they're not handing over all the transactions undertaken by one of the big banks. They are being guided.
Isn't this a huge burden on, well, you don't have small banks, but we do here.
We do. We have small banks, don't worry.
Okay, well, wouldn't this just a colossal burden that they have
Tremendously.
to, every transaction, they have to say, might this be some weird flavor of dual-use goods that we're unaware of? Do they have to have someone trained in dual-use technology at every small bank?
The system that we have created over the last 25 years or so puts a huge burden on the banks, on all banks, full stop. We would not create the system that we have today if we started with a blank sheet of paper today. The way I think we're trying to address that, as I say, is by making the assessments risk-based. So don't spend all your time trying to find everything all the time. Focus on this particular area, this particular theme, this lead. And that's what we're trying to do in the UK through this thing, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, which is trying to empower the banking system to be smarter at interpreting their own data themselves.
If I may offer a comment following up to this, and that comes through the theme we've been discussing and to your
314 A and B, yeah.
Congressman, yeah, right, on information sharing, if you will. It's not all doom and gloom. And there are some bright spots of partnership in the United States. And it's certainly, if I may just offer a note of praise to this legislation, which suggests that they're, to your legislation, Mr. Chairman, prioritizing the threats, if you will, the financial criminal threats. That's an excellent innovation in our current system, and it will help get better at evaluating risk and understanding what are the supervisory priorities, what is the risk. To the issue about information sharing, I'd like to offer some praise for the outstanding work of TFOS at the FBI working on terrorism financing in the United States. They have managed, in what is legitimately a fairly chilly relationship between regulated financial entities in the United States and their regulators, to bridge a number of divides, to have excellent working relationships with financial institutions and with the intelligence community in order to speak together, gather information pursuant to terrorist threats that Orlando, San Bernardino, Las Vegas, ones that affect us here at home, foreign fighters that also affect us, security concerns outside our borders. And they have managed to pioneer a unique in our financial system, in our law enforcement community, relationship, partnership, where they're able to use both those official subpoenas, MLATs, official tools to gather information, and also relationships of trust and constructive exchange between these constituencies to do excellent work. I hope that that kind of model can be used also in the counterproliferation sphere, the WMD folks who work on that issue in the law enforcement community and others. But this is a bright example I think we should hold up and praise and try and see emulated elsewhere in the law enforcement community.
Okay. Mr. Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the note. Glad that you called some attention to and praise for our existing law enforcement folks whether they're in Treasury or Department of Justice or Homeland Security. We've had some really great capabilities, and by and large, these people are there doing the right things and looking for better tools to be effective in it. And frankly, the banks, it's amazing to me how enthusiastic they've been about trying to help with national security. Certainly, they do have true reputational risk and some fraud that they want to protect, but a lot of it's just genuine desire to make sure that they help the cause of securing our country. I guess to Mr. Foster, I think he highlighted the point that where the state of technology and everything is, to truly know what's going on, if you really wanted to write good algorithms, you would probably want to know every transaction and who was the beneficial owner of every transaction. We were doing it with stocks, with the consolidated audit trail. We could easily do it with everything else as long as it's not cash. If it's digital, it theoretically could be done. And at this point, you've pushed, oh, well, we got to collaborate more with the banks. We got to collaborate more with the banks. And if they don't collaborate sufficiently enough, now they've really got reputational risk. You're not being good deputies, okay? And we're not here yet. In many cases, though, we've approached it. If you think about where the logical end of this might be, it's almost like the government's actually putting brown shirts into the organization, and when the bank needs some more, they just call up and send more brown shirts in, right? So that's where we could go to. So why not just let the government operate it? It's such a synergistic partnership. It's approaching other ideologies that the world has seen become very abusive, that we've tried to use civil liberties to protect against. And in the U.S., the Bill of Rights is that bulwark. So I guess that's the Pandora's box we're all reluctant to. And the premise that, as you highlighted in 6068, the base language that we're going to criminalize the least sophisticated businesses, less than 5 million in revenue, less than 20 employees, if they don't fill out this form. If you changed companies and you added a new shareholder, but you didn't go get permission from the government, or I mean, not really permission, just disclosure. But then it turns into permission. This is a system we've worked hard in America to reject and help the world reject. And it seems in the name of security, we're trading away an awful lot of liberty. And I guess that's the concern. Hopefully we get it right. I appreciate your input. And I think you add a lot to some of that dialogue, and we can probably have it offline with some of the...
Could I add, could I respond in some ways to it? Because
yeah, please do.
I've been involved in trying to set up big data systems at the Department of Homeland Security on querying, essentially it's U.S. exports. We have hundreds of millions that have to be queried, and you set up big data systems to try to understand it better and ferret out illicit networks. One has an acronym of BEEP. The problem in the banks is that I don't think you could do what you're most fearful of. I don't think you could digitize and assess all the banking information that's taking place. The numbers are just too vast. Maybe if there's, in the future, maybe that's possible. But I think that what you mentioned about being a good citizen, I think is the driver and should be the driver, that the banks want to be good citizens fundamentally and are willing to voluntarily or meet the requirements of the law to provide certain information. I think it's the job of the government to make sure that that information is what's really needed and to be able to guide the banks of how to do the searches. I mean, that's part of the problem is the banks don't know how to do these searches. And I think it's the responsibility of the government to step in and try to help resolve that essentially that search problem. And cooperation, I think, is the key, not getting more data. Because I don't think we can, in the government, can actually process it in an effective manner. It's so much.
Mr. Budd, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to elaborate a little bit on Mr. Albright. Number one, we have the banks very concerned about the SARS and how much information and compliance costs that they have. With this potential review,
Number 4.
one of the problems with banks is that they're so demoralized by having to put all this information in the system and comply with it, but they don't know if it actually does anything. Would the banks be a part of this? Would they understand? Would they narrow it down? Would they change the SARS to make the banks know that they're actually accomplishing a mission here?
Yeah, I think you certainly would want to talk to the banks a lot about this, about what what is in their mind is useful. I mean, in a sense, they're the first line of defense, and they understand criminal activity, unethical activity, and so their input.
Let me interrupt. So
critical.
just briefly, did the SARS actually? Are there other questions that you think would be better on the SARS, or does it need an overhaul?
Well, one is, and again, I don't know, I haven't confirmed this, but I'm reading from a colleague's article that there's no checkbox on the SARS if the banks suspect the activity is related to proliferation. I mean, you think that for what we're talking about, that would be a critical checkbox, and that would educate the companies, too, of what to look for. I also think there has to be some give and take. I mean, our system is has such levels of classification. I know it's hard, but there has to be a way to tell the banks who in a sense, the bad guys are and how are they operating today. A lot of times these lists are how they operated yesterday, not today. And I think you have to find a way to share the intelligence information in real time so these banks then become better lookouts and a better front line of defense.
So we're essentially telling the banks how to comply. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but we're telling them how to comply, but does that compliance lead to us catching more bad guys? I don't know. That's something we should certainly take a look at.
So at the end of the day, it looks like there is a fairly large consensus that some form of beneficial ownership actually needs to be reported. We've got to solve that problem among us here, among us policymakers here. But I think that probably is going to begin to address in the largest way possible this financing of threats that come through weapons of mass destruction, whatever the process is of breaking the sanctions. Again, a very thorny problem, but we're dedicated to it. I very much appreciate your spending the extra time with us and addressing these extra questions. I appreciate the focus here to give us really good talking points for this second round of questions. So thank you again for your time and for your testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for your response. I just ask that you please respond as you're able. This hearing is adjourned.